Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. I am so grateful to all of you. As Candace mentioned, I've written a couple of books. The problem with writing books on history is they're almost immediately outdated. So keep that in mind, especially with the springs, because as Candace said, we've been working for the last couple of years to do a lot more research on what's in the springs, how they function within the greater ecology. There's so much more information that should be added to that, and so we are working with the City of Steamboat Springs on a website that will be constantly updated with all of that so that we can keep everyone fresh in what we're doing. And I'm gonna get us logged in here. Oops. All right, because we have a lot of scandals to talk about tonight. How many of you have heard of Perry-Mansfield? Wonderful. This is going to make my job so much easier tonight. So we'll get a little bit into kind of the accomplishments of the women, and then we'll jump into our scandals. Because I think it's important to understand that besides this legacy that they've created, they were such visionaries and so imaginative and innovative for their time. Both of the women were chosen for the Governor's Award. The oldest, Bobby Perry middle, and then Charlotte Perry the youngest. They were expected to milk cows, they were expected to take care of the house, and there was no differentiation between Bobby and the girls, right? Everyone did everything. We'll talk more about how that played out a little bit later. And then we have Portia. And Portia's really interesting. Her father managed hotels when she was young, and so they moved place to place to place. And so one time, she was a very outdoorsy person. Her father never discouraged her from riding bikes or climbing trees, which was something girls did not do in that day, which of course Portia wanted to do. But one time she decided, I'm just going to take my younger sister, and at this time Portia was about 9 years old. Her little sister was probably a couple years younger, on a 14-mile hike. Down the railroad track, with no signs on either side of the railroad track to go visit her aunt. And so fortunately for them, a train did not come by while they were on it. And when she got to her aunt's house, she did admit it might have been a little far. So her aunt got her on a train and got her back home. She also had a couple brushes with death at a very young age, which is kind of interesting. When she lived in Florida, she went out on a boat with just a stick in the boat to kind of see what she could see. And as she was cruising around, a copperhead snake drops down off of a tree into the boat, coiled and ready to strike her. And right as it was, she had the good sense to pick up the stick, hit it over the head and kill the snake, which she then carried home to her father to show him. Another time when they were in Michigan, she actually almost drowned. She decided she wanted to jump off the end of the pier and swim back to shore. And so she jumped off the pier, but it was a super windy day and there was a lot of undertow. So every time she'd start to get out, she'd get pulled back underwater, and she was starting to get exhausted. Fortunately, there were a few men, including an uncle of hers on the pier, who were able to hold each other by the legs to get down to get her out of the water. Her biggest concern when she got out was not that she was going to be dead or die, it was that they were going to put her over a barrel to push all the water out of her. And then another thing I kind of find amusing is their relationship with religion. So both of the women grew up in religious households. They both believed in religion, but they believed in religion in a natural way, that God was all around you as opposed to being in a church. And when Portia went to Smith College, she refused to go to church. And so the dean called her into her office and said, Portia, why aren't you going to church? And she said, I don't want to. And no one had ever said that to the dean before. Fortunately, the dean was a little smarter than the student and said, well, what about the singing? Do you like the singing? And she said yes, and so she was able to go to, I think Vespers it was, to listen to the singing. And that's how they got her kind of into the church to fulfill that requirement of Smith College. All right. So, now we get into our scandals. What's in a date, and why is a date even scandalous, right? So everyone who knows Perry-Mansfield probably knows the story. Perry-Mansfield was founded in 1913 and has been the longest continually operating performing arts camp in the country. It actually was not founded in 1913. So we know, looking at different newspaper collections and things like that Portia worked with Charlotte in Chicago from 1912 to 1914. And if you go through the Colorado newspaper collection, which is actually one of those resources that has changed our perception of history. Because until then, all we had were oral recordings and things like that, right? From around like what we had within our community. This newspaper collection has given us so many facts we didn't have access to before. But in 1915, the first report comes out that Greek goddesses are going to come from the east to dance in the Colorado Mountains. And in April of 1915, there's an article saying bare-legged Chicago maids to dance in airy robes on Colorado Peak. And it says, for above the clouds, 8,000 feet above sea level, a bevy of modern goddesses are to establish a camp, and bare-legged and wearing flowy and flimsy Grecian robes, while away the hours dancing on snow-capped peaks. And then we also know that according to the Steamboat pilot, it was 1916 before they established in Steamboat Springs. And that article reports that the Rocky Mountain Dancing Camp, the women purchased the land from F.A. Metcalf that year, 1916, started construction immediately and had it open for camp just barely by that summer. So that's your first scandal. It was not 1913. Are we still the oldest performing arts camp in the country? Yes, we are. All right. First year at camp. So imagine this. There's these women in Eldora, Colorado, and they are outdoors and they are just doing what they do, which is a very actually tough regimen of dance all morning. They would have lunch, they would swim or horseback ride in the afternoon, and then do theater in the evening. But in the morning, they're out in the hills in these gauzy dresses and their bare feet, and they're just gorgeous. And this guy is hiking along the hills across from them, and he looks over and is like, what is this I have here? So of course he reports it to the Denver papers that there are these nymphs in the hills of that and that gets people's attention. So all of a sudden you have these men coming up with spyglasses to look and see what they can see. And I have to tell you, the women were not always even in their dresses. So there was a little less. So who knows what they got to see, but they definitely got a very good reputation that summer, I would have to say. As dancers. All right, and then we get to Steamboat Springs. So the first year in Steamboat Springs, you gotta imagine what Routt County would have been like when we came here, right? Predominantly agricultural community, 1909, the trains coming through. So it's a very different world than it is now. 1913, Carl Howson is just being introduced to the community. Things are starting to change. But here come two women that say we're gonna start a dance camp out in the middle of nowhere. And so there was a little resistance from the community. Some of the husbands forbade their wives from actually coming on the property because they didn't want them to be influenced by these two women. And so they had to drop all the groceries at the bottom of the driveway and get their horse, their donkey Tango, to come down and help them pick it up and take it back up to the camp. And so the one woman left a note saying that in addition to dropping off groceries, she would no longer be able to step foot on campus at the request of her husband, which is very interesting. And then I just recently reread this account from Charlotte Perry talking about the first years, and this kind of made me a little bit sad. It says, the first years were very intriguing. If we'd known what we were getting into, I don't know whether we would have started it or not. Because the town of Steamboat had, well, people didn't receive us with any great enthusiasm. They insisted immediately that no woman come on the grounds at all. Our milkmen had to deliver milk, and if anybody had eggs or anything like that, they had to leave them at the creek at the bottom of the hill and pick it up, because it was dangerous to have women exposed to these things. And then there was another woman in town who was very vindictive and wrote letters saying that they were in cahoots with the devil and that she would make it her life mission to drive them out of the town. So it was a pretty rough start. They, of course, didn't fold to it because they believed in what they were doing, and the way that they got the townspeople involved in it is they invited them to their dance performances. They said, come and see what we do. And it was when they actually got to see the dancers and see the classiness and the beauty in what they were doing that the townspeople started to come around and get involved. So that is our next scandal. And then we'll get into some people, because people are kind of as scandalous as anything else, right? So we have this Marjorie Perry, and she is on the left up there, and you can see how they're dressed. It's not exactly in the typical skirts that you would expect women to be in. So Marjorie also started her scandalous life a little bit early. Now I told you that they all had to do the chores, and part of the chores were milking the cows, but Marjorie would actually take the cow milk and then go to the neighbors and try to sell the cow milk to the neighbors. Didn't get the best reputation for a prominent family to have their daughter going door to door selling milk. And then she gets to Smith College and she starts a club called the GDs. Now, I have one way of looking at it. She said it meant the get dirties. You can look at it any way you want, but it was a group that went down and get into the outdoors and get as dirty as they could. She refused her debutante ball, never married because she loved her freedom, and so her father was the one who kind of took her under his wing, and she became his right-hand man in business, and she loved that she had money and could do whatever she wanted, and she didn't want to settle down and have children. In her early years, she was one of the best sharpshooters of any women in the United States. And when she went on her hunting trip, she put on heavy flannel shirts and chaps just like the cowboys, and that caused some scandal in itself because a lot of the men had never seen a woman out in the backcountry. She captured bears. On one of her trips, they found a little abandoned bear cub, and so she said, well, I should just take that home with me. And she did, and she called it Perry-Mansfield. And it was said to eat food out of her hand and follow her around just like a puppy dog would. On another occasion, they brought home 2 bear cubs, and she threw a teddy bear tea. The teddy bear tea was in all the papers all throughout Denver, and there's a ton of accounts of it, because she had in the back a campfire like you would. She pitched a tent, and she was in her cowboy gear, and then the front of the house was decorated in all of these beautiful dragon snaps and different flowers, and you could go out and have your coffee off the stove and meet the 2 bears that they had caught, and they were chained in the backyard. One of the bears turned out to be a little grumpier, and as it got older, it got a little more aggressive, so they ended up euthanizing that bear, and the other bear got sold to the zoo. So she had no fear of really anything. And then she goes, you know, she's a big adventure woman. And one time she said to have skied in front of the Moffett train in a huge whiteout snowstorm to guide it to where it was going to go because they couldn't see on the tracks. And of course, she had no fear of that. And then there's Carl Howelson, right? So she's the one who goes to Hot Sulphur Springs. And when she's there, she meets this guy who's very charismatic. He's called the Flying Norwegian, and he's a ski jumper. And they immediately hit it off, so he takes her down a ski hill in her big skirts and everything and shows her what fun it is to ski for fun. Because up until that time, you've got to remember that people skied as transportation to get from one place to another. And now all of a sudden, you can just have a good time, kind of change the perspective on a lot of things, and especially those dark winter days. And so she was the one who convinced Carl Howelson to come up to Steamboat Springs and show the community what ski jumping was all about. He did that, of course, because of Carl. We have the Steamboat Springs Winter Sports Club, we have the oldest winter carnival west of the Mississippi, and was there a relationship there? Because did you just hit it off with a guy and like, we should just be friends? Well, the rumor has it, there was a little romance there in the beginning. They stayed very good friends for many years, but Carl did get married. He went back home, and according to the reports, his wife did not appreciate the friendship he had with Marjorie. And so he had to end that friendship after a while. That did not set Marjorie back too far. She was all about living life as large as she could, however she could. She became the head of the equestrian program at Perry-Mansfield. Her philosophy was, if you're on a horse and you can get stung by a fly and not fall off your horse, you're okay. And if you get lost, follow the river downhill, and you'll eventually get to town. And one of the campers took her up on that. And they spent hours looking for that camper and not being able to find her. And they said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm following the river, I want to go home. So sometimes it fell back on her. She also has another scandal that's wrapped around Eleanor Bliss. So in 1924, Eleanor Bliss, who is the niece of a very famous dancer, she is Eleanor T. Flynn has a dance school in Chicago, and she wants her niece, Eleanor Bliss, to take it over for her. So she sends her and her mother to Perry-Mansfield to learn how to dance and to really hone in those skills to take over this dance. Well, Eleanor gets out to Perry-Mansfield. She's given the royal treatment. They're even close to a bathroom, which is, you know, pretty wonderful at Perry-Mansfield. And she decides, I don't really like dance, but I do really love horses, and I really love this whole program. And she fell in love with being on the trails, being out in the backcountry. And she decided when she came back the following year, she did not want to do dance, and she totally stepped away from the dance community and continued riding horses. And she and Marjorie Perry rode horses and were the best of friends for years and years and years. But that scandal was a lot for Portia and Charlotte to try to explain to Eleanor T. Flynn why your niece came out for one summer and now all of a sudden does not want to be involved in dance anymore and really loves the wilderness of Colorado. So there's a little bit about that. And then, of course, being that outdoors woman, she would ride her horse to Denver and back 200 miles twice a year. One time, she convinced her friend, who still stayed her friend after that, to go with her, and it ended up being in this huge snowstorm where they literally had to go off the top of a mountain, white out, couldn't see where they were going, and of course Eleanor's horse didn't want to go down, so she had to get off and lead the horse down, and she said, after that, that's you. You have a good time with that. I'm going to kind of do my own thing over in the yards here. So we love Marjorie. She skied until she was 85 years old, and she was inducted into the Colorado Ski Hall of Fame. All right, so now we know Marjorie. Now let's hear about Bobby Perry, who killed a man in cold blood. Bobby Perry was considered to be kind of the nicest of the Perrys. He kept the family together. He was the one who kept the sisters from bickering while they loved each other. I think it was a love-hate relationship. If Marjorie said this, do this, then Charlotte did everything else. And so Bobby Perry held them together. But when he was running the mines in Oak Creek for Sam Perry, he was actually kidnapped. And so the kidnappers stalked him for 2 days, and they finally grabbed him. And he said, well, if you're kidnapping me, I need a coat and some blankets. And they let him go in and get a coat and some blankets and get some food. And then they began their trek into the wilderness. And so they went out and they wrapped his arms in ropes, so his arms were tied down by his side. And they forced him to write a ransom note for $15,000 for his father. So his father gets this ransom note that his son's been kidnapped, and he's advised to get marked bills from the bank. And meanwhile, Bobby Perry's out, and it's an older man and a younger man that have kidnapped him. The older man seems to be a little more friendly and a little more willing to listen to Bobby Perry, that he's not really rich, he's collecting a salary, he's working hard, but the younger man really wants the $15,000. So at night when they rest, Bobby Perry tries to chew through the ropes. So he's chewing through the ropes around his arms for 2 nights. And when he's almost through it, one of the kidnappers catches him, hits him over the head and says, oh no, you're not doing that. Like, we're gonna get the money. And so he finally, after I think 3 nights, gets loose. And he knew as soon as he was loose, he had to make a move, because both of the kidnappers had guns on their laps. One of them was asleep and the other one wasn't paying too much attention, and it was the older man not paying too much attention. So he jumped up, grabbed the older man's gun. The younger man went to lift his gun, and Bobby said, run or I'll shoot. And the younger man didn't run, and he actually shot him. And he thought he shot him right in the heart, but it turns out he shot him in the shoulder. Bobby Perry ran 7 miles back to his home, called his father. They got the sheriff involved, and the sheriff said, well, did you kill him, or did you not kill him? And he said, well, I shot him, and I don't know if he's dead or not. So they went back to find the body, and there was a bullet hole in the shoulder, and also in the head. And Bobby Perry said, well, I definitely didn't shoot him in the head. I was careful not to do that. And they said, well, either the younger man must have shot him or he must have killed himself knowing he was going to be caught. And so Bobby Perry was actually cleared of murder charges because of that. They caught the other kidnapper, and he spent the rest of his life in jail. I know, right? That's such a good story. Most people don't know that. All right, the bare feet. Right? If I were to take off my shoes, I don't think you would be scandalized. You might be like, okay, you can put those back on. Right? But back in the day, dancing barefoot was considered extremely scandalous. Isadora Duncan, who was sort of a mentor to Charlotte and Portia just in the dances that she did, ended up going to Europe because the people in the United States were so conservative about the clothes you could wear on stage, that you had to have stockings on stage. There was no freedom of body in their mind. And so Charlotte and Portia sort of picked up that mentality of, we want to dance free, we want to dance like the wind and the sun and the trees, and we want to move our bodies. But in Boise, Idaho, the editor of the local paper wrote an article condemning them for their immorality. And it was actually a minister from Denver who defended them. His name was Dean Hart. Then when they went to White Plains, New York, because they traveled all across the vaudeville circuit, and that's another little scandal in itself, in that when they started the dancing company, Portia was called Portia Sweat, was her mother's name. And they had a friend who went, the Portia Sweat Dancers does not have a great name. They did that. And so they did, so she changed her name to the Perry-Mansfield Dancers. But when they were in White Plains, the company that they were supposed to dance for would not let them go on stage unless they either had shoes or pink tights on. And they were running around trying to find it, and they said, it's just not going to be the same if we have to have clothing on. It's just not going to work as well. And so they called up the local Smith College Club and got the president of the club to go down, and she marched on down into the venue and said, "You have to let them on." And Charlotte remembers, I don't know with what authority she said that, but they then let them go on and dance. The only place they were not allowed to go was Oregon, where they did have to wear stockings for their performance. So this is a poster of back of the vaudeville days of some of the different costumes that they had. And you'll see in the middle is the name Virginia Mansfield. So this is Portia Mansfield's cousin who wanted to dance. And Portia saw real talent in her. But of course, her father, being the father of those girls of that time, said, "There's no way, it's immoral, and I don't want you having any part of it." So Portia said to her, "Here's a check," and sent her some money and said, "Beg, borrow, or steal the rest and get out here. I think you can make a professional company." And so when her father went on a business trip, Jenny Mansfield went to her uncle, borrowed the rest of the money for her uncle, and disappeared before her father came home. Yep. And her father, of course, was just wanted nothing to do with it, didn't want to see them perform, didn't want anything to do with his daughter, until of course they went through Chicago. And at that point, because us women, we have a lot of sense, the mother said, "We are going to see our daughter, and we are going to see her dance." And when they saw her dance, they saw how beautiful it was. And of course, with Portia's convincing, the father finally forgives his daughter, and they were able to reunite and have a relationship. Jose Limon. So for those who don't know, Jose Limon was a modern dancer. He was out at camp in the early 1920s, 1930s, and he was so exuberant and full of life. He started a dance company that still exists in New York City today, and what is so exciting is that Perry-Mansfield is co-commissioning a new work with them that they've worked on the last 2 summers at Perry-Mansfield, and it's premiering in New York in May of next year. So these relationships that happened way back when are still continuing. So Jose Limon came back to camp in the 1930s, and he was described as being very improper. Kind of, I would say, he didn't have a filter. It was sort of how you want to describe it. He would go around camp and say things like, "Gee, that's a hell of a little cat," and hell back then was about as bad of a curse word as you could curse, and he would say it in front of the little campers, who would then go around all day blushing, with their hands over their faces giggling, and when Helen Smith, who was the glue that held Charlotte and Portia together, so she was a good friend of the ladies and helped run the camp, when she would say to the girls, "What's going on?" they would just giggle and giggle, and their faces would get really red. And when she finally got them to tell what was going on, it was inevitably something Jose Limon had said about something that he was so excited about. He was originally an artist, so he painted throughout his life, but he wanted to be a famous painter until he saw El Greco. And then he realized, this person has done everything that I've always wanted to do in my life. And he went into a Great Depression, and his friends decided to send him to Doris Humphrey, who was a modern dancer at the time, to pull him out of his depression. And so he went there and he became a dancer and a choreographer. But when he came out to Perry-Mansfield, there was still that artist in him, right? And so one day Charlotte and Portia say, "You know, we're going on this trip," and he didn't want to go. And he said, "Well, what am I supposed to do while you're gone?" And they said, "Well, paint the closets." So most people just paint the closets. Of course, he paints this beautiful design on the closets that they still kept out in Carmel many, many years later. His artwork is in Cabine at camp, so you can actually go and see Jose Limon's artwork on the campus of Perry-Mansfield, which is pretty incredible. But he also had these kind of demons around him. He said, "I always feel that there is someone right at my shoulder. I'm just scared to death of them." And he would never walk alone at night on camp. Someone always had to walk in with him because he was afraid of the angels, but he was more afraid of the ghosts. And so I thought that was a really interesting tidbit about Jose Limon. And like I said, he had that exuberance. So when they went on an automobile ride, he would stand on the... Hello? There we go. Just decided to quit it. I'm talking too much. I think that's, and the talk's over. Just kidding. All right. So he was on an automobile with running boards. And he would just get so excited and go, "The wildflowers, my God, look at those, wow, I can't believe it." And that infected everyone around him. And that's kind of the spirit that camp still has today. You have these kids that come out from these cities all across the country that have never been in the wilderness, and they see the stars and they are in awe. They see the trees and they are in awe. So we are so excited that we still have the oldest performing arts camp in the country. All right. Who here knows Dustin Hoffman? Who knows that name? All right, you love it. So Dustin Hoffman, I think we're dying. Okay, we'll see if this is going to stay on. So Dustin Hoffman was the winner of 2 Academy Awards. He was also the star in The Graduate, Kramer vs. Kramer, Rain Man, and many other films. And he came out to camp, and he had this habit of banging on these bongo drums all day. Every time he had a free minute, just banging on the bongo drums, and it would make people crazy. And they would say, "Hey Dustin, do you think you could stop banging on the bongo drums?" He'd be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And then the next day, he'd be banging on his bongo drums. So of course, Portia, always the optimist, is like, we can harness his energy. She knew he also played the piano. Just being, Charlotte and Portia, are you here? How did he play with us all instead? So he came out, and she harnessed him to play the piano, and he actually played these beautiful accompaniments for her dances, and was very adept at changing things up when she needed him. But he also didn't like to bathe. And that in the dance classes got a little difficult. And one time one of his teachers said, "Dustin, all right, I'm just gonna, can you hear me if I speak really loud?"
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, we'll try this. So one of his teachers said to him, "You know, Dustin, you're gonna have to bathe because the dancers don't want to dance with you." And he's like, "But I did bathe." And he said, "Well, when?" And he said, "Well, Saturday." And she said, "But it's Tuesday. You actually have to bathe every day." And so he had this nickname, Dusty Hoffman, because of that. But he was an incredible actor, and he acted with Charlotte Perry in a lot of her plays. And the stories always went that he was very stubborn, and he and Charlotte Perry butted heads. And a little louder? So he and Charlotte Perry would butt heads all the time, but he and Portia really connected. When he was in Denver one time, he was reported as saying to the reporters, "Tell Portia I say hi." So, Carolyn, was that 2 years ago we were in Carmel? How? Last year? This year? 2 years ago. We're in Carmel at Charlotte and Portia's house because the woman who had lived there, and we'll talk about her a little later, had passed. And we see this envelope, and there's a headshot of Dustin Hoffman in it. And we're like, well, of course that's to Portia. And it was actually addressed to Charlotte. So you never know how much of these stories have truth to them and not. What we do know is that when Lucille Bogue first wrote about these stories in her book, Dancers on Horseback, Charlotte was really upset. She was really offended that you would speak poorly about anybody that had come to camp, because their philosophy had always been, we build people up. And she didn't feel like the book had done it. And Helen Smith actually had to run interference to repair the relationship of the author Lucy Bogue, who had also been a camper at Perry-Mansfield and went on to start what is now Colorado Mountain College, right? So she had to repair that relationship. And I think that's an important lesson to think about as we look at histories and talk about people, is how do we do it in the most respectful way that we're lifting people up. Although I just told you the terrible story, so I didn't do a great job with that one. Given that we have a camp that sits in the middle of the woods, not a surprise that at some point something's probably going to catch on fire. And one night, about 2 or 3 in the morning, Clan, which was a kind of log room built as a green room for the college group, catches on fire. And of course, because they have their regular fire drills, everyone hops into action. Smallest small children from this high and up are carrying buckets of water from the main house down the Clan to throw water on it. It was a very organized system. And up in the trees, the sparks are catching tree to tree to tree. And on the back side of the Clan is a propane tank. And they knew if the fire reached that, it would explode and they would likely lose the entire camp. So they're rushing around, trying desperately to put out these fires. And of course, Portia, is she concerned? She's got her film camera out, and she's running around filming it. And I just want to read to you her recollection. So Barney Brown, who was one of the instructors, she says, Barney went inch by inch around the building, the Clan, which was in hopeless flames, and poured water all around it, as I remember, to protect it. It was dangerous and spectacular. The fire illuminated him so that he was gorgeously outlined. Down below was a great row of funny little women figures in their hair in all states of preparation for the next day, and in their underclothes, handing rhythmically their little buckets of water in their pails from their rooms. Somehow it had all the elements of a grand opera. That gorgeous light in the sky, the complete quiet, and the way in which people organized themselves, it was quite beautiful. And it's just like Portia to find the beauty in every little thing. The morning after, the cooks knew that these people had been up all night trying to get the fire out. They called in the fire service and were eventually able to get everything out. And so the cooks made a huge breakfast for them. And at the breakfast, Portia comes in and hands this little dilapidated flower to Charlotte. And everyone breaks out into applause. And camp had been saved. All right, Stevens College. So thinking about, could you imagine what Steamboat Springs would be without Perry-Mansfield? It really has grown up as part of our identity, right? So Stevens College took over Perry-Mansfield in 1965. They bought it for $10. And they had, I know, right? Great deal. Strawberry Park, prime property. So the teachers there, they had Harriet Ann Gray, who had been teaching at Perry-Mansfield. They had this long connection with the camp, so it made sense that they would take it over. And when they did, they put a lot of money into it, because as you can imagine, if you've been out there, you know the facilities. They're all wood, everything falls apart, things have been kind of patched together with tape and glue, is what they said, including the water system. I can tell you right now, not much has changed. Just a couple of years ago, a huge amount of work was done on the water and sewer infrastructure to get it back up to date. But they came in, and after so many years of it, they struggled, right? They struggled with attendance because they were really only catering to the Stevens College crowd as opposed to having a national camp for people. By 1978, after they added some new cabins so they could rent it out as a year-round facility, they finally got into the black. And just as their enrollment's growing, all of a sudden things are starting to fail at Stevens College in their Missouri campus. And they're having to sell off a lot of land, and they have a really hard decision to make. Do we keep Perry-Mansfield and save that, or do we sell it and take care of the facilities that we have? And so they made the hard decision to sell it, and there was a huge uproar about it. It made the CBS News. Students wrote in from years ago that had been to camp. There was even a senator, or a member of Congress, Ben Nighthorse, who wrote to the president to keep camp running for just one more year so a new organization could come in and see if they could keep it running. But I'm going to read you a couple of kind of protest statements and things that people wrote about Perry-Mansfield, because it's the same things we hear from campers at camp year over year over year. So at Stevens College, the students were saying, "Save Perry-Mansfield, keep art alive to a rap beat, and art has no price, and dance and dreams equal Perry-Mansfield." One of the students said, "I have learned at Perry-Mansfield. I have grown there, loved there, laughed there, and cried there. Most of all, I felt like somebody there. It's probably the only place where I have lived where I feel as if I belong. Sincerely and seriously, Nina LeBettery." And then Lee Remick, who's an actor, said, "Of the idea of PM being sold, an awful idea. I really feel my career had a great part of its foundation built at the camp. It would be a great loss, as the location adds to all the elements of artistic freedom and creativity we are all looking for. Please accept my nay vote in selling." Fortunately, the community of Steamboat Springs rallied. They were able to get a huge amount of donations from individuals, from corporations, from foundations, and they were able to save Perry-Mansfield for a lot more money than the $10 that they bought for it. And Friends of Perry-Mansfield is the group that still runs it today. So now we are looking at over 100 years of Perry-Mansfield history. The ghosts. So everybody wants to know, are there still ghosts out there? Well, there have been so many stories and rumors about it that A&E even brought their Ghost Hunter series out to camp. It's a true story, because there were reports of ghosts that could have been harmful, and some people were worried if I send my children there, are they going to be harmed by these ghosts? And so A&E brings out their Ghost Hunters, and they actually do detect ghost activity. And here's the places they found it. In Little Ballet, which is one of the dance studios, there's reports of a woman who sings opera in there late in the night, and anytime anyone gets close, she stops. There's reports of movement in the music room in Cabine, which is believed to be Charlotte Perry. There's a woman who writes all these songs about Perry-Mansfield and Charlotte, and there actually were these noises that happened during the filming of the show. And they'd say, "If that's you, if you're a ghost and that's you, could you make a noise here?" And then there would be a knock there. And they'd say, "Could you back away from it?" And there would be a knock back here, which was really interesting. The one rumor or the one ghost story that they were not able to prove was the story about a boyfriend who found out his girlfriend had come out to camp and fallen in love with another man. And they got into an argument, and supposedly he slapped her. She fell back and hit her head, and he thought she was dead, so he rolled her into the pond at camp. And there she lies at the bottom of it. And that's the one mystery that we don't know if it's true or not, because no bodies have been found. So be careful when you go out to camp. I will share my one or two ghost stories that I feel like there is a presence out there. And I'm not the biggest ghost believer. I actually did see a ghost at the depot, I think, once. But my very first day, so this past summer, I did some work out at Perry-Mansfield. And I'm a 51-year-old woman. I have snapped my bra on every day for 40 plus years. I've never not snapped my bra on. First day out there, I'm in the office and I'm like, the shoulder straps are feeling kind of loose. This is really weird. And my bra was unsnapped. And I swear that was Charlotte laughing. And I was like, all right, I got you. I'm paying attention. And then we had another evening where between the plays I had to give one of the talks that, give us all your money, we love you, this is the history. And of course the lights go out. And I'm like, there you are. Like they are, I feel like they are still around. Interestingly enough, Portia is buried in the Steamboat Springs Cemetery. So if you get a chance, she and her brother are both buried there. Charlotte is buried in Denver with her family. All right. This is the story everyone wants to know. Yeah. Was there a love story? And I would say, I guess it depends on how you define love, right? Because there was definitely heart love between the three women, right? So you have Charlotte Perry, Portia Mansfield, and then Helen Smith, who's the glue that holds them together. Now you've got to imagine, when you're with someone every day of your life, and you're Charlotte and Portia, and you're starting a new camp in the woods, of course you love each other, just like you love your sister and your friends. Is there anything deeper? There's no proof of anything deeper, but we know there was a very deep love there. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to get through that many years doing those many things together. As they grew older, though, Charlotte's friendship with Portia, they had very different lives and very different interests, and Charlotte and Helen Smith actually spent the majority of their later lives together. Again, there's nothing to indicate that it was anything more than a very close friendship of two women who had been through a lot together, but they spent a lot of their time in Carmel, California. And there was this love that they spread at camp that spread out to a lot of different people. Because neither woman had children, they adopted women into their lives, these young women that were sort of like their surrogate children, and they cared for them like you would your daughter. Rusty DeLucia, who still teaches out at camp, talks about how Charlotte Perry was her second mom, right? And she was taken into that family. Portia adopted a woman named T. Ray Faulkner, and that was part of her family. So they built these families that were bigger than themselves. And then, of course, Charlotte adopts this girl. And this is a crazy interesting story that Carolyn's already chuckling at because she's been through it with me. But there's this young woman who is said to be Charlotte Perry's cousin or somehow related. They won't talk about how they're related, but they have very similar cheekbones. And this woman kind of comes under Charlotte's wing, and Charlotte really takes her in as her own. And then all of a sudden, when Charlotte Perry passes years and years later, she leaves her entire estate to Ingrid. And not very little bit to her family, but nothing significant to her actual blood family. Everything goes to Ingrid, including the house in Carmel. And so for years and years, people from Perry-Mansfield reached out to Ingrid saying, do you have any plans for if you pass, what you might do with all the memorabilia that's still there from Charlotte and Helen and Portia? And she would always kind of deflect it, and she made no plans for it. Well, she passed 2 years ago. And so Perry-Mansfield got a call from the woman running the estate saying, we've been asked to call you because there may be things of Charlotte and Portia's, and the Perry family got involved, and were invited out to go and see what was out there. Carolyn Lushker, who's in the audience here, went out with myself and Noelle Hefty, and boy, wow, this house, so in her later life, Ingrid became a hoarder, and she had the house so filled with things that towards the end of her life, she couldn't even get into the main part of the house. She lived in a side room of the house. And when they cleaned out the house, they took out 900 pounds of garbage, just straight garbage. And the rumor is that she was adopted as an adult by 5 different people, at least, and was heired all of their estates. And so within the house, she also had furniture from all these different people and paintings from all of these different people. And it was just wild to go in there. I mean, even after they cleared out all the garbage, there was almost no space to move around in there with things that were valuable. And so fortunately, the Perry family was able to recover a painting of the great-grandmother, so Charlotte's mother, Lottie Perry. We were able to find a lot of historic records and photographs that they were able to save that all would have just disappeared if they didn't know what it was for or why it was there, right? And then we did a little more digging on Ingrid to see a little bit more about her past. Well, it turns out she had a brother, and she never told anyone she had a brother. She was estranged from him at a young age. The rumor is that she was Adolf Hitler's illegitimate daughter. And it is a rumor that is online that you can see from a family she lived with for a time. So the story goes that during the Great Depression, her father got a job in Florida. He was a chef and had to take the job because they needed the money. Ingrid refused to go, so her mother stayed with her in New York. That started to cause a split in the family dynamics. And so eventually the mother went down and Ingrid stayed with this sort of adoptive family. And this young man has online, it's a rumor that came up that was never denied by neither Ingrid or his mother. Now we do know that Ingrid came across from Germany to the US in 1944 on the US Bremen. Those are all records that you can search. We don't know where her past was. There's rumors that she was either smuggled out of Germany or kidnapped and brought to the United States. So her brother is on my list of people that I really need to dig into and find out a little bit more about. But she was this wild character. And she was interviewed by DU several years ago about Perry-Mansfield. And every time she spoke, it was like she had a mask on and she was a full actress. There was no person in her. There was this cover. And I don't know why. And so they say towards the ends of her life, she was starting to lose her memory and wasn't quite in control of things. And so she never made that plan. And so we are fortunate with Perry-Mansfield to certainly be able to have all those archives. They are currently getting digitized. Thanks to Carolyn's generosity, we are going to be launching an online digital archive of Perry-Mansfield's photographs this year, and we'll continue to add to it because there's over 100 years of photographs and memorabilia and things like that. And so we hope that you'll all learn even more about the history of Perry-Mansfield through that. And so those are just a few of the scandals of Perry-Mansfield. There are more, but I'm not allowed to say them. Does anyone have any questions? None. Wow, this is great. You're also educating now. Yes. I was going to say we have some very important historians in the firm. Is there anything I've gotten wrong?
Just one thing. It's not told that. As you talked about the kidnapping.
Mm-hmm.
As you drive south from Oak Creek towards Pittsburgh, you'll see on the left-hand side that they've got a frame around, fence around. Just as you talk about the kidnapping of Bob Perry, as you drive south now from Oak Creek to Pittsburgh, just outside of Oak Creek by the little football field, on the left-hand side, you'll see a fenced-in area that is kind of dug around and so on. That's where they buried the man who had kidnapped Bob Perry. They wouldn't let him bury him in the cemetery, so that's his grave there that you just drive by.
That's awesome. Thank you.
What years was Dustin Hoffman there?
He was 60s, right, Carolyn? I think like around 67, 1967.
That was before he became a movie star?
Way before, yeah. This would have been very early in his acting career. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Do you know anything about the relationship between Marjorie and Charlotte?
Just as like their sisterly relationship?
Yeah, was there anything that, I know when you're doing research, trying to, you're reading a lot of stuff and seeing a lot of stuff, and I don't know, did Charlotte, at least on that end, ever mention Marjorie? And
Oh yeah. Yeah. So the question is about the relationship between Marjorie and Charlotte, and they definitely had a bit of a contentious relationship. So they were known to kind of butt heads over things. After Eleanor Bliss decided not to follow her career in dance, Marjorie was kicked out of the equestrian program and never taught at Perry-Mansfield again. I know later in life, Marjorie, they both used the same investor for their money, and Marjorie found out that he was kind of a crook and told Charlotte to take out her money. Well, because her sister told her that, she didn't, and she ended up losing a lot of money because of that. So it was a kind of a love-hate relationship with them, and it's kind of like that big sister, younger sister, I think. So while they did do family events, there was definitely a little contention there. Yeah. Yes.
So what made them pick that spot? You talked about them from being Chicago. How did they discover Steamboat and pick that area?
Great question. So the question is, how did they discover Steamboat and pick the area that they picked? So Charlotte Perry's family had been in Denver. The two women came out here. Portia was invited to come out for a bear hunt with the Perry family. And they went kind of down south into the mountains. And during that bear hunt, they talked about, wouldn't it be amazing to have a camp outside of the cities, because the cities would get so sweltering hot and dirty in the summertime that they thought it would be really incredible to be able to dance and explore in the great outdoors. And so the first year they picked Eldora because Charlotte Perry's mother had a friend, Annie Dixon, who had a lodge in Eldora that she loaned to the women to have the camp there. So that was more a reason of convenience than anything else. Because of the altitude there and the huge thunderstorms that rolled through every day, it was really hard for the dancers, as well as all the men in the hills that were spying on them. So they wanted, it's true, so they wanted somewhere a little bit more private. Initially, they looked out at Crozier Lake, which is out more towards Oak Creek. And again, the weather patterns around there, Bobby Perry advised them against because of the thunderstorms that would roll through. And it was Bobby Perry who originally identified the property that they're now on.
Can I see it? Let me just add a little bit more to that. In 1906, Sam Perry, who was one of the major investors in the railroad, in the Northwestern Pacific and in the Moffett Road, he bought from James Crawford the town of Steamboat. He was developing the town of Steamboat. So they had Perry Mine, which is a Malkin mine in Oak Creek, as well as the mines up throughout the area. So when it came to developing, which Sam Perry and the family was for, that's why they put in Towson Hill as part of the dancing, because they had a real deep involvement in the Steamboat in this area right here.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Was there a question in the back yet?
I wonder if Gloria Gossard hung out with
Yes, the question was, did Gloria Gossard hang out with the ladies? And I believe Gloria and Portia actually had a very close relationship. The two women, and Gloria lived in Portia's halfway house with her, which is, if you're coming from Perry-Mansfield towards town, that first right, that steep right, there's kind of some cabins there. That's where Portia lived, and Gloria lived there for quite a while with her. So yes, they did have a good connection.
Did Eleanor Bliss teach at Perry-Mansfield?
I don't believe she did. I think that my understanding is that after she would spend most of the years back home on the East Coast with her family. She was the first woman ever to work at the Explorers Club, which was an all-male club at that point, and it was explorers from all around the world who were doing kind of the most extreme things. She was allowed in during World War II, was it called? World War II, I believe. She was allowed in because men didn't want to have the kind of political conversations you'd have to have with different wars happening, and Eleanor was able to navigate that. After her parents died, she came back to Steamboat Springs full-time, which is about 1968, and got involved with the Steamboat Springs Arts Council at the time, now Steamboat Creates, and really worked with Carol Finnoff to turn that into a center for the arts. So to my knowledge, no, but she may have, but I don't think so.
So Simpleton knows about dancing.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. Perry-Mansfield has really been a part of this community.
And one of the things they did was during the war, when so many of the young men in the valley were off fighting in Europe, the campers, the older campers, would be assigned to work on the ranches to help with the haying and helping to take care of animals. So I'm not sure if the young ladies from the East Coast who were used to very privileged lives knew what was in store for them when they came to Perry-Mansfield, but Perry-Mansfield has always worked on the whole person. So anyway, just one of the other little things that happened out there.
Yes, they did do a lot of involvement with the different ranches where you could pay extra to go out and spend a week on a ranch and learn how to hay and how to do chores out there and things like that, right? Which is pretty wonderful. And they always brought the community in. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here.